The medicine bottle slipped from Marshal Quinlan Jericho's fingers and shattered on the frozen ground. He stared at the broken glass glittering against the snow like scattered stars, and for one terrible moment, the howling blizzard around him went completely silent in his mind. Everything stopped. The wind, the cold eating through his coat, the exhaustion pulling at his bones like iron weights. All of it vanished, replaced by a single devastating thought. He had ridden 11 hours through a whiteout blizzard. He had crossed the frozen Black Creek at the risk of his horse breaking through the ice. He had pushed through drifts so high they had nearly swallowed him whole. He had done all of it for that one small bottle of laudanum and fever tincture that doctor. Hargreaves had pressed into his hands back in Caldwell, Kansas, with the warning that the child had maybe 2 days left if the fever did not break. And now it was broken on the ground. His horse, a big gray named Cavalry, stamped and blew hot breath into the frigid air, as if even the animal understood the catastrophe of the moment. Quinlan dropped to one knee in the snow. The liquid was already soaking into the white ground, dark and spreading like a wound. He reached for a shard of glass without thinking, then pulled his hand back. There was nothing to salvage, nothing at all. He pressed his fist against his forehead and stayed there for a moment in the howling dark, the blizzard screaming around him. Somewhere in the vast emptiness of the Kansas prairie, in January of 1878, then he stood up. He swung back into the saddle with a grunt of pain, his hands so cold he could barely feel the reins, and he turned Cavalry's head toward the distant lights of the Nolan homestead, still nearly a mile away through the storm. Because Quinlan Jericho was not the kind of man who knelt in the snow and accepted defeat. He never had been. And he was not about to start on account of a blizzard, a broken bottle, or the fact that a woman named Genevieve Nolan had not said a single kind word to him in the 4 months he had known her. None of that mattered right now. What mattered was the 5-year-old boy inside that farmhouse whose fever had been climbing for 6 days. What mattered was getting there. He pushed Cavalry forward into the howling white dark and began to think very hard about what he was going to say when he arrived without the medicine. It had all started 4 months earlier, on a September afternoon that could not have been more different from this frozen nightmare. The sky high and blue and the prairie grass still golden from the long summer, when a wagon had rolled into Caldwell with a broken axle and a woman driving it alone. Quinlan had been standing outside the sheriff's office on Main Street, drinking a cup of coffee that had gone cold, watching the dust settle over the afternoon, when the wagon lurched to a stop in the middle of the road with a crack like a rifle shot. He had set down his cup and walked over, because that was what a marshal did, and also because something about the way the woman handled the situation caught his attention immediately. She did not cry out. She did not panic. She climbed down from the seat with perfect calm, walked around to assess the damage, said one word under her breath that was decidedly unladylike for 1878, and then straightened up and looked around the street for help with the expression of a woman who expected to find none. She was somewhere around 29 or 30, with dark auburn hair pinned up under a practical wide-brimmed hat, and brown eyes that were sharp and measuring in the way of someone who had learned early in life not to take anyone's word for anything. She wore a plain gray dress that had seen better days, and she carried herself with a particular kind of dignity that had nothing to do with wealth or station, and everything to do with character. She had 2 children in the wagon behind her. An older girl of about 8, who had inherited her mother's auburn hair and watchful eyes, and a small blond boy of about 5 who was peering over the side of the wagon with total fascination at the broken wheel. Quinlan walked over and touched the brim of his hat. "Marshal Quinlan Jericho, madam." "Looks like your axle gave out," She looked him over with those sharp brown eyes. She took in the badge on his chest, the gun at his hip, the broad shoulders and the jaw that had not seen a razor in about 3 days, and whatever she concluded from this assessment, she kept it to herself. "Genevieve Nolan," she said, "and yes, I can see that." It was not an unfriendly response. It was simply direct. Quinlan found himself appreciating it. "I know a man who can fix it," he said. "Ezra Potts runs the livery on the East End. He is good with wheels and he is honest about his prices, which is more than I can say for some." She looked at him again and something shifted in her expression. Not quite trust, not quite warmth, but a slight relaxation, the way a person looks when they decide that somebody is probably not trying to cheat them. "How long will it take?" she asked. "Afternoon, maybe. I can take you somewhere to wait. There is a boarding house on 2nd Street that serves a decent lunch." "I cannot afford a boarding house." She said it without embarrassment, just as a fact, and Quinlan respected that. "Then you can wait at the Marshal's office," he said. "It is not fancy, but it has a stove and I have coffee." She studied him for one more moment and then she nodded. "Thank you, Marshal." That was how it started. Not with fireworks or immediate attraction, though Quinlan would later admit, only to himself and in the privacy of his own thoughts, that he had noticed she was beautiful in that first moment in a way that had nothing to do with the surface of things. It was the quality of her attention, the steadiness behind her eyes that had caught him. She had waited at his office for 4 hours while Ezra Potts fixed the wagon. During those 4 hours, Quinlan learned that she was a widow of 2 years. Her husband Thomas Nolan having died of a fever that had swept through their homestead, 40 miles southwest of Caldwell. He had left her with the 2 children, Clara, who was 8, and little Samuel, who was 5, and 160 acres of Kansas prairie that she was farming alone. He learned all of this not because she volunteered it freely, but because her daughter Clara talked with the easy openness of a child, while her mother sat very straight in the chair across from his desk and drank her coffee and said little. Genevieve Nolan was not a woman who gave away her story to strangers. She had clearly decided somewhere in her difficult life that information was a kind of currency that needed to be spent carefully. What he could not have known that afternoon, watching the afternoon light move across the floor of his office while Clara told him about their chickens, and Samuel fell asleep on the settle with his boots still on, was that this woman was going to become the most important person in his life in a matter of months. He could not have known it, but looking back later, he thought perhaps some part of him had already sensed it, the way you can sometimes sense a change in weather before the clouds even form. He had walked her to her repaired wagon when Ezra came to tell them it was done. Samuel was still half asleep and had to be carried, which Quinlan did without being asked, lifting the boy with the ease of a man accustomed to carrying heavy things, and settling him gently into the back of the wagon on the folded blanket. Genevieve Nolan had looked at him then with an expression he could not quite read, something surprised and something guarded at the same time. "You did not have to do that," she said. "I know," he said. She picked up the reins. "Thank you for your hospitality, Marshal Jericho." "Quinlan," he said, without fully planning to. She looked at him. "Quinlan," she repeated, as if testing how it sounded. Then she clicked her tongue to the horse and drove away down the dusty street, and he watched the wagon until it turned the corner and was gone. He went back inside and stood at his desk and looked at the empty coffee cups for a minute. And then he thought about her all the way through supper and into the evening, which was unusual enough that he noticed it. He told himself it was nothing. A chance meeting, a widow with a broken axle, a practical woman doing her best in a hard country. He was a marshal in a town that needed one, a man with a dark past that had a way of following him around like a shadow, and he had no business thinking about auburn hair and brown eyes that measured everything they saw. He told himself all of this very firmly. And then October came, and with it, the news from the Nalan homestead that made his heart drop in his chest. One of the traveling traders who came through Caldwell regularly, a man named Henderson who covered the southwestern routes, stopped in at the Marshal's office on a Tuesday morning and mentioned, as if it were a minor thing, that he had passed by the Nalan place 2 days ago, and things looked rough out there. A neighbor had told him that someone had been cutting Genevieve Nalan's fence lines at night, letting her cattle onto the open range, and that she had ridden out twice to find them and brought half of them back. The other half were gone. Quinlan had his hat on before Henderson finished the sentence. He rode out to the Nalan homestead that same afternoon and arrived to find Genevieve out in the near pasture, mending a stretch of fence with a pair of wire pliers and a determination that was something close to magnificent and something close to heartbreaking at the same time. She had her sleeves rolled up despite the October chill. Her hair was coming loose from its pins. She did not hear him ride up. "Mrs. Nalan," he said. She straightened and turned, and whatever surprise she felt at finding him there, she controlled it almost immediately. "Marshal Jericho." "I heard about your fence lines." Her jaw tightened. "Did you?" "I want to help." Something flashed in her eyes that was not quite anger and not quite gratitude, but somewhere complicated in between. "I have handled it." "You have handled it," he agreed. "But whoever is doing it will likely do it again, and you cannot be out here every night watching for them." She looked at him for a long moment. "I appreciate the concern, but I have been managing this land for 2 years without help, and I intend to keep managing it." There it was. The stubborn, proud wall of her. He had sensed it in September. He understood it now better. She had been left alone with 2 children and a farm and no one to depend on, and she had built herself into someone who could not be knocked down by relying on no one but herself. It was admirable. It was also going to get her into serious trouble, and Quinlan knew it. "I am not questioning your ability to manage," he said carefully. "I am questioning whether you should have to do it alone when there are laws being broken on your property." She held his gaze for a moment, and he could see her weighing it. Then she said, "A man named Randall Greer has been after this land since before my husband died. He owns the spread to the north and he wants a clear run to the river. He made Thomas an offer twice. Thomas refused both times. And now he is trying to make things difficult enough that you will sell." "That is my suspicion." "Then it is my business as much as yours," Quinlan said. "That is harassment and destruction of property, and in Comanche County it falls under my jurisdiction." She looked at him for a very long moment, the October wind moving through the dry grass around them, the sky going the deep blue of late afternoon. Then she said, "I did not know you had jurisdiction out here." "I do not, technically," he admitted. "But the county sheriff is 100 miles north and not particularly interested in the problems of a woman homesteader. So I am making it my business." Something changed in her expression. The calculation was still there, but underneath it, something else. Something she did not want him to see and pulled back quickly. "Why?" she asked, and the single word was very direct and very honest. He could have given her a simple answer. He could have said it was the law or that it was the right thing to do, both of which were true. But the way she was looking at him made a simple answer feel dishonest. "Because I rode out here in September and watched you drink your coffee and not say an unnecessary word and carry 2 children's worth of trouble on your shoulders with a kind of dignity I have not seen very often," he said. "And because I have been thinking about you ever since, and I am not very good at pretending otherwise." The silence after that was so complete, he could hear a hawk calling somewhere far above them. Genevieve Nalin looked at him with an expression he had not seen on her before. Something opened in it and then closed again almost immediately, like a door blown shut by the wind. "Marshal Jericho," she said finally, "I appreciate your honesty, but I am not in a position to think about such things. I have a farm and 2 children and a man trying to ruin me, and that is quite enough." "I understand," he said. "I am not asking you to think about such things. I am just answering your question honestly." She held his gaze for another moment, then turned back to her fence. "You can ride the perimeter if you want," she said. "Look for any other cuts." He did. He rode the perimeter and found 2 more sections that had been cut and hastily repaired with inferior wire, clearly not by her. He noted the locations, studied the ground for tracks, and found boot prints heading north toward the Greer property. When he came back to where she was still working, Clara and Samuel had come out from the house to watch. Clara was solemn and helpful, handing her mother tools when they were needed. Samuel was chasing a chicken around the yard with the focused commitment of a person with a very important mission. Quinlan sat on his horse and watched this small family in the fading October light, and felt something in his chest that he had not felt in a very long time. Something that was both warm and terrifying in equal measure. He stayed for supper. He was not invited exactly. It happened in the way things sometimes happen on the prairie, through necessity and practical kindness rather than social niceties. The evening had grown cold and dark before he finished his assessment of the property, and Genevieve had come to the door and stood in the lamplight and said, without looking directly at him, that there was stew if he wanted it before the long ride back. He wanted it. He sat at her kitchen table across from Clara and next to Samuel, who had decided within approximately 4 minutes of meeting him that Quinlan was the most interesting person he had ever encountered, and had a great many questions about law enforcement that needed answering urgently. Genevieve served the stew and sat down, and Quinlan watched her with Clara, the quiet attentiveness of it, the way she smoothed her daughter's hair back from her face, and then pretended she had not done it. He watched the way she cut Samuel's meat without being asked and refilled his cup and made it look effortless. All the invisible labor of a mother, performed with the same steady competence she applied to everything else. He rode home in the cold dark of October and thought about her the entire way. He came back the following week and the week after that. Each time he had a reason. He had information about Randall Greer. He had spoken to the county magistrate. He had found a way to place a formal complaint that would make Greer's continued harassment a legal risk. All of these things were true. All of them gave him a reason to ride out to the Nalin homestead, and all of them meant he sat at that kitchen table again and drank her coffee and talked about practical things. But underneath the practical things, something else was happening, slow and quiet as a river changing its course. He could see it in the way she began to look at him when she thought he was not watching. He could feel it in the way the silences between them had changed from cautious to comfortable. He could hear it in the way she had started to call him Quinlan without hesitation, as if his name had always been part of her vocabulary. He was falling in love with her. He knew it clearly and completely by the end of October, and it frightened him in a way that very little in his life had managed to. Because Quinlan Jericho was a man with a history that he had not told her. A history that had a way of making women step back when they learned of it, and he did not think he could survive the step back from Genevieve Nalin. He had been married before, 8 years ago in Missouri, to a woman named Anne. They had been young and foolish and brave in the way that only young people manage, and for 2 years it had been something close to the life he had imagined. Then Anne had died in a riding accident, sudden and senseless, on a Tuesday morning in April, and something in Quinlan had gone very quiet and very hard. He had thrown himself into the law after that. He had worked as a deputy, then a marshal, moving west with the frontier, accumulating a reputation for being thorough and uncompromising and completely humorless about anything to do with justice. He had done things in the line of duty that he was not proud of, made choices in difficult situations where all the options were bad, and carried the weight of those choices in the particular way that men in his profession learn to carry weight, quietly and without complaint, and at significant cost to everything else. He had arrived in Caldwell 14 months ago with nothing but a horse, a badge, and the dim intention of doing his job and not thinking about much else. He had been good at it. He had not expected Genevieve Nolan to drive a broken wagon into the middle of his carefully organized emptiness and make everything complicated. He told her about Anne on the first Wednesday of November, sitting in her kitchen after supper, while the children were in bed and the wind was beginning to have the first edge of winter in it. He was not sure why he chose that moment. She had been telling him something about her own husband, something about the way Thomas had faced the last weeks of his illness with a particular kind of quiet bravery, and Quinlan had listened to her describe grief from the inside, and felt that it was the wrong time to let her think she was the only one who knew what it felt like. She listened to him without interruption. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "How long did it take before you could sleep again?" "About 2 years," he said honestly. She nodded as if this made complete sense. "For me, it was 18 months. And then one morning, Samuel climbed into bed with me at 4 in the morning because he had had a bad dream, and I was so focused on calming him down that I forgot to be sad. And by the time he was asleep again, I realized I had been asleep too properly, and it was morning." Quinlan looked at her across the table. "He saved you." "They both did," she said. Then she looked up at him, and there was something in her eyes that was completely unguarded for just a moment, something that took his breath away. "I am not made of stone, Quinlan," she said. "I know that is what people think when they see me, but I am not." "I know," he said. The moment held between them, fragile and charged, and then she stood up and began to clear the cups, and the moment was gone, but something had been established that could not be unestablished. November passed in a series of visits, each one a little longer than the last. He dealt with Randall Greer directly and with enough legal threat to make the fence-cutting stop. He rode out to the homestead, once to help repair a section of the barn roof that had been weakened by an early snow and was threatening to come down on the milk cow. And he spent a Saturday morning up on that roof, with Samuel passing him nails from below, and Clara reading aloud from a book she had borrowed from the traveling teacher. And it was the most content he had been in years. He did not say anything about the feeling growing in his chest. He watched Genevieve watch him from the doorway and said nothing, because she was not ready and he knew it, and because he was not entirely sure he deserved to be ready either. Then December arrived, and with it, the news that Randall Greer had left the county on account of some legal trouble elsewhere that Quinlan had been quietly instrumental in bringing to light, and the immediate threat to the Nolan homestead evaporated like morning frost. It should have felt like an ending. Instead, he found himself riding out to the homestead on a cold December afternoon without any official reason at all, just because he wanted to see her, and that honesty felt like stepping off a cliff. She met him at the door before he had even dismounted, with flour on her hands and a look of mild exasperation that he had come to understand meant she was more pleased than she was willing to show. "You do not have official business anymore," she said. "No," he agreed. "Then why are you here?" He looked at her steadily. "Because I wanted to be." The exasperation shifted into something else. She looked at him for a long moment, flour drying on her hands, the cold afternoon light catching the copper in her hair, and then she stepped back from the doorway. "Come in," she said. "I am making bread." He helped her make bread. It was ridiculous. A Marshal with his hands in dough, and she laughed at him when he did it wrong, which was the first time he had heard her laugh without reservation, and it was the best sound he had ever heard. Samuel was beside himself with delight that Quinlan was in the kitchen. Clara observed the whole situation with the ancient wisdom of an 8-year-old who understood exactly what was happening between adults and approved of it. He stayed until after supper. He helped clear the table and dry the dishes without being asked, which earned him a look from Genevieve that was startled and then very soft. When he was leaving, standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands, she said, "Quinlan," and he turned. She was standing in the lamplight of the kitchen, and she looked at him with those brown eyes that missed nothing, and she said, "Be careful riding back. The temperature is dropping." It was not a declaration. It was not even close to one. But the way she said it, the particular way she said his name, told him everything he needed to know about where they were and where they were going. And he rode home through the cold December night feeling something he had almost forgotten the name of: hope. Christmas came and went quietly. He spent it at her table, which she had not invited him to and which he had not exactly asked to attend, but which had happened through the natural gravity of two people moving inevitably toward each other. He brought gifts for the children, a small carved horse for Samuel that he had commissioned from a woodworker in Caldwell, and a set of pencils and drawing paper for Clara, who had shown him her drawings on one of his visits and had a genuine gift for it. Genevieve looked at the gifts and then looked at him, and something in her face was both grateful and pained at once. "You did not have to do that," she said. "I know," he said, which had become something of a thing between them. She had made him a scarf, dark blue wool, knitted herself, which she handed to him with studied casualness as if it were nothing, looking somewhere to the left of his face. He held it in his hands and felt the weight of it, the time and attention it represented, and when he looked up at her, she was still not quite looking at him. "Genevieve," he said. She looked at him then, and her chin was up in that way she had when she was being brave about something. He stepped forward, slowly enough that she could step back if she wanted to. She did not step back. He put one hand gently against her face, and she closed her eyes for just a moment, and he kissed her, soft and careful, and she kissed him back. And it was the single best moment of December, maybe the best moment of the year, maybe longer than that. When they separated, she opened her eyes and looked at him and said, "I have been trying not to do that." "I know," he said, "it complicates things." "It does," he agreed. "I have children. I know them," he said. "I like them very much." She looked at him for a long moment with an expression that had finally let go of most of its guardedness, and said, "I am not easy, Quinlan. I need you to know that. I am stubborn and I do not trust quickly, and I have opinions about everything." "I had noticed all of those things," he said, "and I have been riding 40 miles out and 40 miles back multiple times a week regardless, which I think answers the question of whether they bother me." Something in her eyes went very warm. "You are a foolish man," she said. "Deeply," he agreed. She laughed again, that full, open laugh, and he thought he could live off that sound for a considerable time. So January arrived with the two of them in a state of tentative, quietly joyful beginning. Not yet anything they had named out loud, but real and mutual and growing. He visited every week. They talked for hours. She let him see more of herself each time, the sharpness and the softness and the long exhaustion underneath the competence, the grief that was not gone but had been folded away somewhere livable. He told her things about himself that he had not told anyone in years. About his father, who had been a hard man and a fair one. about his time in Missouri before he moved west, about the specific kind of loneliness that had been his company for 8 years and which, in her kitchen with her children and her flour and her laughing, had begun finally to loosen its grip. Then, on the 14th of January, Samuel started with a fever. Genevieve sent word to Quinlan through the trading post, a short message in her direct hand, that Samuel had been ill for 2 days and she was managing but wanted him to know. He rode out the next morning and found the boy in bed, flushed and miserable but not yet alarming, and found Genevieve doing what she always did with worry, which was channel it into relentless practical action. She was making broth, boiling cloths, checking temperature with the back of her hand, and the thermometer the traveling doctor had left on his last circuit through. Quinlan stayed 2 days, sleeping in the barn and spending the daylight hours helping Clara with the animal chores so that Genevieve could stay close to Samuel. He and Genevieve spoke in the quiet, efficient language of 2 people working together toward the same purpose. And underneath, the practicality was the particular tenderness of 2 people who had recently kissed and were aware of it every moment, even while pretending to be entirely focused on other things. Samuel seemed to improve slightly on the 2nd day, and Quinlan rode back to Caldwell for duty, leaving with the feeling that the worst had probably passed. It had not. Word came on the 19th of January that Samuel had taken a serious turn. The fever had climbed back up sharply overnight and the boy was delirious, could not keep water down, and the situation was rapidly becoming dangerous. The message came through a passing rider who had stopped at the Nolan homestead for directions and been asked to carry it to Caldwell urgently. Quinlan read the message at his desk at 8 in the morning. By 8:15, he was at Dr. Hargreaves's door. Dr. Hargreaves was a compact, serious man in his 50s who had been practicing medicine on the frontier long enough to have very few illusions and a very well-stocked medicine cabinet. He listened to Quinlan's description of the symptoms and asked sharp questions, and then went to his cabinet and mixed a careful preparation. A fever tincture combined with a small amount of laudanum to help the child rest, which he explained was the best treatment available outside of a hospital. "Get this to the boy in the next 2 days," he said, wrapping the bottle carefully in cloth. "If the fever does not come down soon, the risk of serious damage is significant. He is 5 years old and he has been fighting this for a week." Quinlan took the bottle in both hands and held it with the care of something irreplaceable. "I will get it there," he said. Dr. Hargreaves looked at the window, where the sky had gone the particular flat gray of a serious approaching storm. "Marshal," he said, "there is a blizzard coming in tonight. I can see it from here. Riding out to the Nolan homestead in a blizzard is dangerous." "I know," Quinlan said. "There are no other options. No one closer." "No one closer with the right medicine," Quinlan said. "And no one who will ride through a blizzard for it, which amounts to the same thing." Hargreaves studied him for a moment and then nodded slowly. "Ride carefully. Keep the bottle inside your coat. The cold could compromise the preparation." Quinlan tucked the wrapped bottle carefully into the inner breast pocket of his coat, against his chest, where his body heat would keep it from the cold. He buttoned his coat over it. He felt the small weight of it there like a heartbeat. He walked to the livery and saddled cavalry with the methodical efficiency of a man getting ready for something serious. He packed saddlebags with what he might need, extra blankets, his warmest gloves, a canteen, hardtack. He checked his compass twice. The storm hit at noon. He was about 7 miles out of Caldwell when the sky opened. Not the gentle start of a snowfall, but the instant, total commitment of a full plains blizzard, wind and snow arriving simultaneously like a wall. Visibility dropped to 20 feet, then 10, then less. The temperature fell so fast he could feel it happening. Cavalry, who had been through enough Kansas winters to have opinions about them, dropped his head and pushed forward with the resigned determination of a horse who trusted his rider and wished he did not. Quinlan leaned low over the horse's neck and navigated by compass and by the lay of the ground under him, the subtle rises and falls of the prairie that he had learned over months of riding this route. He crossed Dry Creek at the 2-hour mark, the frozen surface holding under cavalry's cautious hooves but groaning in a way that made Quinlan's teeth clench. He kept the horse moving, steady and not hurried, until they were clear of it. He lost the trail at the 4-hour mark, in a section of open ground where the drifts had obliterated every landmark. He stopped cavalry and tried to get his bearings, consulting his compass and his memory of the terrain, and made a decision that turned out to be correct, north-northeast, and found the fence line of the Nolan property 2 hours later by almost riding into it. He felt the bottle inside his coat every few minutes, checking with his hand through the wool that it was still there, still intact, his body heat keeping it safe. It was the most precious thing he had ever carried, and he knew it. He was picking his way along the fence line toward the house, the lights finally visible through the blizzard like something miraculous, when cavalry shied at something in the snow, a dark shape that turned out to be nothing but a drifted pile of brush. And in the startle and the shift of balance, the medicine bottle slipped from his inner pocket. He had not zipped or buttoned the inner pocket. He had not thought to do it. In the horror of the moment, as he heard it hit the frozen ground and shatter, he understood that it had worked loose from his pocket in the hours of riding and had finally fallen when the horse moved sharply. And now there was nothing. He sat in the saddle in the screaming blizzard, a mile from the house, with an empty coat and a broken bottle in the snow, and thought. He thought about Samuel, small and blond and full of questions, lying delirious in his bed with a fever that had been climbing for a week. He thought about Genevieve, who had been alone with this for 6 days, doing what she always did, which was everything she could think of and then more, but who needed what only Dr. Hargreaves could provide. He thought about the bottle. He thought about the temperature of the bottle against his chest during all those hours of riding, about the cloth it had been wrapped in, about the contents. The bottle was shattered. The medicine was gone, but Dr. Hargreaves had not given him only that bottle. He had given him a prescription, written on a card in his breast pocket, and the understanding of what the medicine contained. Fever tincture and laudanum. 2 components. Quinlan reached into the pocket behind the one the bottle had been in and pulled out the prescription card. Still there. He looked toward the lights of the farmhouse through the blizzard. Genevieve Nolan, he knew, kept a medicine cabinet. He had seen it. It was in the kitchen, a small wooden cabinet on the wall above the dry sink. She kept willow bark tea, bandaging, and he had seen on one visit a small brown bottle that she had said was for toothache. Laudanum for the pain, not much but some. He also knew, from the months of conversation at her kitchen table, that she had a knowledge of herbal medicine that she had learned from an older woman in Ohio before she came west. She kept dried herbs in a tin above the stove. He had watched her make things from them. He had asked once what she used them for, and she had told him in detail, including something she called a fever draw, willow bark and dried elderflower, and something else he had not retained. He did not have the medicine Dr. Hargreaves had prepared. But he might have the components of something that could do part of the same work, already present in the farmhouse. He pushed cavalry forward toward the lights. When he got there, he had barely dismounted before the door flew open. Genevieve stood in the doorway in her nightgown with a shawl thrown over her shoulders, her hair completely loose and her face carrying the look of someone who had been awake for days and holding something together by will alone, Quinlan. just his name, but the way she said it. He walked through the snow toward her. He had ice in his beard and he could barely feel his hands, and the look on his face must have told her something was wrong before he said a word, because her expression shifted. He stopped in front of her and said, "I dropped the bottle. It broke." "I am sorry, Genevieve. I am so sorry. But I think there is another way, and I need you to help me think." She looked at him for a single moment, not with the collapse he had been afraid of, not with the anger he had half expected. She looked at him with an expression that was completely focused and said, "Come inside." She had been awake for 48 hours. He could see it in the line of her shoulders and the way her hands moved, still precise but with the slight delay of deep exhaustion. Clara was asleep on the settle, having apparently refused to go to bed in another room and been allowed to stay. Samuel was in the back bedroom, and as Quinlan came through the door, he could hear the boys breathing from across the house, rapid and shallow in a way that made his chest clench. Genevieve listened to him with absolute focus as he explained what he had seen in her medicine cabinet and what he knew about the components of Hargreaves's preparation. She asked 2 sharp questions. Then she went to the kitchen and opened the cabinet and the tin above the stove with the efficient movements of someone who had been thinking about this for days. "Willow bark I have," she said, "and elderflower, and I have chamomile and ground ginger. The laudanum is here, about 1/3 of the bottle." "Dr. Hargreaves said the laudanum was to help Samuel rest," Quinlan said. "His primary concern was getting the fever down and keeping it down. The tincture he made was primarily the fever reduction component." Genevieve was already at the stove, building up the fire. "The willow bark and elderflower together are what my mother's teacher used for childhood fevers. I have used it for Clara and for Samuel before, for smaller fevers. The ginger helps with the stomach. Can you make it strong enough?" She turned and looked at him directly. "I do not know," she said. "I do not know if it will be strong enough for this fever, but it is what we have and I am going to try." Quinlan looked at her across the kitchen. This woman who had been alone with her child's crisis in a blizzard for 2 days, who was standing in her nightgown at a cold stove in the small hours of the morning, and felt something so large in his chest that he did not have words for it. "Tell me what to do," he said. She put him to work. He broke up the frozen water in the pail and melted it in the pot while she measured herbs with the careful precision of someone who understood that, in this case, the amounts mattered. She worked from memory, from what her mother's teacher had told her years ago in Ohio, from the accumulated practical knowledge of a woman who had always had to solve problems with whatever was at hand. While the tea was steeping, she went into Samuel's room and Quinlan followed. The boy looked small and terribly still against the white pillow. His color was wrong, too red, and his breathing had the tight sound of a body fighting hard. Genevieve sat on the edge of the bed and put her hand against his face, and the expression that crossed her own face was the most unguarded thing Quinlan had ever seen on her. He stood in the doorway and watched her, and felt a fierce and absolute certainty settle into him that was different from anything that had come before. Not the tentative hope of December. Not the growing warmth of 2 months of kitchen conversation and slow discovery. Something completely decided. Something that had found its footing. He loved her. He loved her children. He was going to do everything in his power to make this right. He turned back to the kitchen and tended the tea. When she came back, she tasted the preparation and adjusted it, adding a small additional measure of elderflower, and then carefully added the laudanum from her bottle in the proportion she had described to him. She strained it through a cloth and let it cool slightly in the cup. "Help me," she said, and picked up the cup. In the back bedroom, together, they worked to get the medicine into Samuel. The boy was barely conscious enough to swallow, and it took patience, and the particular skill of a mother who knew exactly how to coax a sick child. Genevieve tilting the cup, speaking in a low, steady voice that was different from her normal voice, softer and absolutely certain of itself. Samuel swallowed 3 times, which was enough. Genevieve sat back and Quinlan put his hand briefly on her shoulder and she let him, leaning back against the pressure of it for just a moment before straightening again. They sat with the boy for an hour. The fever, during that hour, did not break. But it did not climb further, and the tension in the boy's small body relaxed somewhat as the laudanum did its work, letting him rest in a way he had not been able to for days. His breathing evened out. The awful rasping quality of it softened. "It is not enough," Genevieve said quietly at the end of that hour, not in despair, in her direct, assessing way. "It may be enough to hold him until morning," Quinlan said. "And in the morning, if the blizzard has eased at all, I can ride back for Hargreaves himself, or for more medicine." She looked at him. "You just rode 11 hours through a blizzard." "I know," he said. "You cannot ride back in this. Not right now, no, in the morning." She studied him with that measuring look, and he met it steadily. Then she said, "You need to sleep." "So do you." "I cannot sleep while he is like this." "Then I will stay awake with you," he said. "You are not doing this alone tonight." The look she gave him then was something she did not try to conceal. It moved across her face openly, all the feeling in it, the gratitude and the exhaustion, and underneath both of those things, something much warmer and much more permanent. "Quinlan," she said. "I am not going anywhere," he said simply. They sat in Samuel's room through the long night, taking turns checking on him, speaking in low voices about small things. He told her a story about a particularly stubborn mule he had known in Missouri, and she told him about the worst winter she and Thomas had spent in their first year on the homestead, when they had been so naively unprepared that they had nearly starved. The stories were not dramatic, but they were honest, the kind of stories 2 people tell each other in the dark when they are keeping watch together, and the pretense of casual acquaintance has been stripped away. Around 3 in the morning, Samuel stirred and asked for water in a voice that was weak but recognizably himself. Genevieve gave him water and he drank, and she put her hand on his forehead and went very still. "Quinlan," she said. He moved to where she was kneeling by the bed. "Feel," she said, and took his hand and placed it against Samuel's forehead. He was cooler. Not well, not recovered, but the burning fury of the fever had dropped. The boy's skin, which had been dry and blazing, was damp now with the faint sweat of a fever beginning to break. The relief on Genevieve's face was the most private thing he had ever witnessed. She bent her head over the bed and held her son's hand and made no sound at all, but her shoulders shook once and then were still, and when she lifted her head her eyes were bright. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and the words that passed between them in that moment were not spoken words at all. He put his arm around her, and she turned into him and pressed her face against his shoulder, and he held her in Samuel's small bedroom in the middle of the Kansas blizzard, the lamp throwing warm light over the sick child who was sleeping easier now. And Quinlan Jericho thought that this was the most important place he had ever been, and the most important thing he had ever done. She pulled back after a while, not hurriedly, and looked at his face. Her hand came up and touched his jaw, the ice-crusted beard from the blizzard, and something in her eyes was so open and clear and decided that it struck him like sunlight. "I did not realize until tonight," she said softly. "What did you not realize?" "How much I needed you, not just tonight, in a more permanent sense." She took a breath. "I am not good at saying these things." "You are saying it perfectly," he told her. She looked at him for another moment, and then she kissed him, there in her son's bedroom with the blizzard outside and the lamp burning low, and it was different from the December kiss, less tentative, more certain. The kiss of two people who have stopped pretending they can go in any other direction. The morning came slowly, as January mornings do. The blizzard had not entirely stopped, but the worst of it had eased by dawn, the winds dropping from a howl to a steady push, the visibility improving enough to see the barn from the house. Quinlan went out in the gray morning light and fed and watered cavalry, his breath making clouds in the freezing air, and when he came back inside, the smell of coffee hit him, and he felt something that was the bodily sensation of home. Genevieve was at the stove, still in her nightgown with the shawl, her hair loose and her face showing the ravages of 2 days without sleep, but her eyes clear and purposeful. Clara had woken and was sitting at the kitchen table with her drawing paper and pencils, drawing something with focused attention that turned out, when Quinlan looked over her shoulder, to be a horse in a blizzard with a rider on its back. "That is meant to be you," Clara said, without looking up. "I have been watching from the window." Quinlan looked at the drawing. The horse was quite good. The rider had a hat that was nearly as large as the horse. "It is excellent," he said. "The proportions are entirely accurate." Clara glanced up at him with her mother's eyes and said, "Samuel is awake. He says he wants porridge." Quinlan put his hand on the door frame and felt something enormous and quiet move through him. Samuel was asking for porridge. Samuel was awake and asking for things. The crisis was not over. The boy would need real medical attention and days more of recovery. But the immediate danger had passed in the night, held back by willow bark and elderflower and a mother's knowledge and a long, cold, desperate ride through a blizzard. "Then we should make porridge," Quinlan said. He stood with Genevieve at the stove and made porridge, and it was such an ordinary thing and such a perfect thing that he wanted to hold onto the moment with both hands. She looked at him sideways as they stood there. "You are going to have to ride back for Dr. Hargreaves," she said. "Samuel needs to be properly examined. I know, I will go this morning. The storm is still partially active, I know." She put the spoon down and turned to face him fully. "You rode through a blizzard," she said. "You dropped the medicine, and you kept riding anyway. You stayed up all night, and you helped me make something from nothing." She stopped and looked at him very directly. "I am trying to tell you something, Quinlan, and I am doing it badly." "You are doing it perfectly," he said again. "I am trying to tell you that I am not going to be the kind of woman who holds people at arm's length anymore," she said. "I have been that woman for 2 years, and I am very tired of it. And I would like to know if you have any serious intentions, because if you do, I have very serious ones myself, and I think we should stop pretending that is not the case." He looked at her. The morning light was coming through the window over the sink, and it fell across her face, and her loose, dark auburn hair and her brown eyes that were currently looking at him with an honesty that was almost too much to look at directly. "I have the most serious intentions of my life," he said. "I have had them since October and possibly since September, if I am being honest, which I am trying to be." She held his gaze for a moment and then said, "Good," with such simple and complete relief that he stepped forward and put his hands on either side of her face and kissed her again. And Clara, from the table, said, "I told Samuel this would happen," in the satisfied tone of a person whose prediction has been confirmed. Quinlan rode for Dr. Hargreaves at 10 that morning, through the diminishing blizzard, on a horse that had every right to refuse and did not. He reached Caldwell in 6 hours instead of 11, because the wind had dropped, and he knew the way better now, and also because he was riding with a particular lightness that had nothing to do with the cold and everything to do with the woman he had left in the farmhouse behind him. Hargreaves came back with him in his own wagon, which was harder going and took until the following morning. But when he arrived, he examined Samuel thoroughly and said that the fever was substantially down, and that the improvised treatment had been sound, and that the boy was going to be fine with several more days of rest and careful management. He also said, looking from Quinlan to Genevieve and back with the clinical detachment of a man who had seen a great many things in his practice, "Whatever you people did, you did it right. This boy is a lucky child." Quinlan thought that was possibly the best sentence he had heard in years. Samuel spent another week in bed, and Quinlan spent most of that week at the Nolan homestead. He could not entirely justify this professionally, but he found that he did not try very hard to justify it, because the feeling of being at that kitchen table in that house with those people had become the thing he oriented himself around. He and Genevieve talked for the first time without the careful management of what they revealed to each other. He told her about his dark past, the full version, about the choices he had made in his years as a marshal that weighed on him, and she listened without flinching. She told him about the loneliness of the homestead after Thomas died, the specific terror of being responsible for two small people with no net beneath her, and he listened without offering the false comfort of easy reassurance. They were both people who had been shaped by hard things, and they recognized that in each other, and instead of making them shy away, it made them move closer. One evening, when the children were asleep, and the house was quiet, and the blizzard was a memory, and the prairie outside was crusted white and still under a clear, cold sky, Quinlan sat across from Genevieve at the kitchen table and said what he had been thinking for days. "I want to ask you something," he said. She looked at him with her level gaze. "Then ask it." "I want to ask if you would consider marrying me," he said. "Not because of propriety or practicality, though both of those things are relevant, but because I have spent 4 months watching you and talking with you and knowing you, and I am more certain about this than I have been about anything in 8 years, and I think you know that I mean it." She was very still for a moment. Then she said, "The children." "I want to be their father," he said simply, "if they will have me, and I will ask them properly and listen to whatever they say." She looked at him for a long time, and he let her look, because she was not someone who made decisions quickly or under pressure, and he would not want her to. Then she said, "Yes, just that." He reached across the table and took her hand, and she turned it over and held his, and they sat like that in the lamplight for a while, the future settling quietly around them like snow. In the morning he asked Clara and Samuel. Clara looked at him with her serious 8-year-old's eyes for a long moment and then said, "Will you still ride cavalry?" "Yes," he said. "And will you still help with the fence sometimes?" "Often," he said. "Then yes," she said, with the brisk efficiency of a child who has made a reasonable business decision. Samuel, who was sitting up in bed with porridge and his carved wooden horse, looked at Quinlan and said, "Does that mean you live here?" "If you would like that," Quinlan said. Samuel considered this. "You can have the side of the barn where the tool shelf is," he said. "But the chickens are mine." "A very fair arrangement," Quinlan said. Genevieve, standing in the doorway, had her hand pressed to her mouth and her eyes were very bright. The wedding was in March, on a day that started cold and then grew tentatively warm, the first real hint of the coming spring working through the prairie air. It was a small ceremony in the Caldwell Church with Dr. Hargreaves and his wife, Ezra Potts from the livery, and a handful of Genevieve's neighboring families who had heard the story of the blizzard ride and had opinions about it that they expressed loudly and with great warmth. Clara wore her best dress and stood very straight. Samuel wore a bow tie that he destroyed within approximately 7 minutes of the ceremony, and appeared entirely untroubled by this. Genevieve wore a cream-colored dress that she had made herself, simple and perfect, and when she walked up the aisle toward him, she met his eyes and kept them, and he thought he had never seen anything so beautiful in his life, not the dress or the day or the tentative spring sunlight, but the look on her face, completely open, completely decided, all the watchful caution of her finally laid down. He said his vows to her in a voice that did not quite steady, and she said hers to him in a voice that was steady as bedrock, because she was Genevieve Nolan, who was not made of stone but was made of something very close to it, strong and enduring and capable of holding enormous weight. When the minister said the words that mattered, Quinlan kissed his wife, and Samuel shouted something enthusiastic from the front pew that made everyone in the church laugh, and that seemed right. They went back to the homestead, which became their home in truth now, Quinlan handing in the keys to his rooms in town and hanging his badge on the peg by the farmhouse door each evening and taking it down each morning, still Marshal of Caldwell, still riding the county when duty called, but coming home each night to the lamp in the kitchen window and the particular rightness of belonging somewhere. He learned the farm the way he had learned law enforcement, thoroughly and with attention to detail. He was not a natural farmer, which Genevieve told him with the directness he had always loved, but he was a hard worker, and he had good judgment about problems, and he listened to what she taught him. And by summer he was useful in the fields and increasingly less disastrous with the animals. He and Clara developed a quiet understanding. She showed him her drawings every week, and he took them seriously, asking questions about the choices she had made, and she bloomed under this attention in the way that children bloom when adults treat their passions as worth discussing. By midsummer, she had filled 2 entire drawing pads and had started on a third. He and Samuel had the uncomplicated bond of 2 people who had decided immediately and without reservation that they were going to like each other. Samuel followed him around the property asking questions at a rate that suggested the child had an infinite interior reservoir of questions that had never previously found an adequate audience. Quinlan answered all of them, and when he did not know the answer he said so, which Samuel respected. He thought sometimes about the night of the blizzard, about the 11-hour ride through the white dark, about the broken bottle in the snow and the cold certainty that had settled over him when he realized what he had to do. About the farmhouse lights through the storm, the most welcome sight he had ever seen. He thought about Genevieve in her nightgown at the door, her hair loose, her face carrying 2 days of alone with a crisis that could take her child, and the way she had said his name. He thought about Samuel's fever breaking in the small hours, and the feeling of Genevieve pressing her face against his shoulder in that small bedroom, and the lamp burning low, and the blizzard outside losing its argument with the night. He thought about all of this, and found that what he felt was not the relief of crisis averted or even the happiness of 2 people finding each other, though he felt both of those things. What he felt at the core of it was a deep and settled gratitude for the broken axle in September that had brought her to his office, for the fence lines that had given him a reason to ride out to the homestead, for the 4 months of kitchen table conversation and careful approach, for the blizzard that had stripped everything down to what mattered, for a stubborn woman who had let him in, finally, after all the reasons she had not to. In October of 1878, Genevieve told him one morning over coffee that she thought they might be expecting. She said it in her direct way, looking at him steadily, and he looked at her for a long moment and then got up from the table and put his arms around her and held her without speaking. She put her hand against his chest. "Well," she said after a moment. "Well," he agreed. Samuel and Clara were told at supper that evening. Clara absorbed this information with characteristic seriousness and said she would need to consider the implications. Samuel immediately announced that the baby's name should be Thunder, which his mother declined with remarkable patience. The winter of 1878 was nothing like the one before. cold and with its share of storms, but nothing approached the ferocity of that January blizzard. Quinlan still felt the weather differently now than he had before it. A sky going flat gray could make him look toward the western range with a particular quality of attention. He checked the medicine cabinet more often. He made sure the supply of willow bark was always well stocked. Genevieve noticed this and said, one evening in December, "You still think about that night?" "Sometimes," he said. She studied him. "What do you think about?" "Dropping the bottle," he said honestly. "I think about the sound it made." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I think about you riding in through that storm. I was at the window when I heard cavalry in the yard. The blizzard was so thick I could not see him at first, and then you came out of it." She paused. "I knew then." "Knew what?" "That I was going to stop being afraid," she said. He looked at her across the kitchen table, this woman who had been the great surprise and the great fortune of his life, and said, "You were never afraid, you were just careful." "Both," she said. "I was both." He reached across the table and she took his hand. In May of 1879, their son was born. He arrived on a Sunday morning with the prairie in full spring bloom outside the windows, and he was a healthy, loud, opinionated child who made his presence known from the first moment. They named him Thomas Quinlan Jericho, Thomas for Genevieve's first husband, which had been Quinlan's suggestion, because he thought it mattered that the children know their history did not have to be replaced to make room for what came after. Genevieve had looked at him when he suggested the name with an expression that was beyond words. She had put her hand against his face and held it there for a long moment. Thomas Quinlan Jericho was, from the beginning, the loudest and most insistent person on the property, which was impressive in a household that included Samuel. He had his mother's auburn hair and his father's gray eyes, and an absolute certainty that the world existed primarily to be interesting to him, which endeared him to everyone immediately. Samuel was an excellent older brother in the way that boys sometimes are, with a protective instinct that surprised and deeply moved Quinlan, considering that Samuel had been so young when his own father died. Clara treated the new baby with the solemnity of a person taking on a significant responsibility, and by the time Thomas was 3 months old, she had made approximately 40 drawings of him in various states. The homestead grew and changed with the years in the natural way of things. Quinlan negotiated a fair purchase of additional acreage to the south when it came available, so that the farm could properly sustain a larger family without the constant knife edge of scarcity that Genevieve had lived on alone. He rode for the county still, but with a different center of gravity, always knowing where home was in the way that had been abstract to him for 8 years and was now completely concrete. He came home one September evening to find Genevieve sitting on the porch steps in the last light of the day, her shawl around her shoulders, looking out at the prairie. He tied cavalry and came to sit beside her, and she leaned against him in the easy way of people who have made a habit of each other. "Clara showed me a drawing today," she said. "Which one?" "Of the blizzard. She has been working on it for weeks. She said she wanted to get the storm right, the way the snow moves in a big blizzard." Genevieve paused. "She is very good, Quinlan, really very good. I think there is something real there." "I have thought so for 2 years," he said. "I want to find a way to let her develop it. There is an artist in Wichita who gives lessons to students with serious interest." He looked at her profile. "Then we will find a way," he said. She turned to look at him. "You mean that?" "I always mean what I say," he told her. "You know that." She held his gaze for a moment with an expression that after all these months and years, he could still sometimes barely stand, the fullness of it. Then she turned back to the prairie and said, "I know," and leaned her head against his shoulder. Inside the house, Thomas was making some kind of announcement at significant volume, and they could hear Samuel responding with patient authority, and then Clara's voice, calming things down in her quiet, competent way. The sounds of the house settling into evening, ordinary and irreplaceable. Quinlan put his arm around Genevieve and looked out at the Kansas prairie, the last light going gold and the sky going the deep, clear blue of fall, and felt the particular quality of a life that had found its proper shape. He thought about the January blizzard, about the broken bottle and the cold and the hour of riding through the dark toward the farmhouse lights, about a small boy with a fever and a woman who was not made of stone, and the extraordinary, ordinary miracle of being exactly where you were supposed to be. He had once thought of himself as a man without a particular destination, a marshal moving west with the frontier, carrying his history and his discipline and his careful loneliness like equipment. He had been good at what he was, and he had not known that what he was incomplete. He understood it now, not as a lack looking back, but as the long preparation for something specific, for a broken axle on a September afternoon, for a woman with sharp eyes and auburn hair who did not waste words, for a kitchen table and a blizzard and a child's fever breaking in the small hours and all the 10,000 ordinary moments before and after. "Quinlan," Genevieve said. He said. "I am glad you were stubborn," she said. He looked down at her. "What do you mean?" She looked up at him with those brown eyes, still measuring, still sharp, and now full of something that had been earned and was therefore permanent. "I mean that anyone else would have turned back at the first hour of that blizzard," she said, "or not ridden at all. I mean that you did not, and that it was not just for Samuel. I knew that even then, and I was too frightened to let myself know it, but I knew." He looked at her for a long moment. "It was for Samuel," he said, "and it was for you. Both things were true at the same time." She nodded, as if this confirmed something she had understood. Then she turned back to the prairie, and they sat together in the last light of the September evening, and the sounds of their children and their house were around them, and the Kansas sky was enormous and clear above them, and Quinlan Jericho, who had once been a man with a dark past and an empty future, held his wife on their porch and was, at long last, entirely and completely home. In the spring of 1881, the Jericho homestead welcomed another addition. Genevieve made the announcement in her characteristic way, direct and without preamble, one morning over the breakfast table. Thomas, now nearly 2 and in the early phase of forming very strong opinions about breakfast, paused his current campaign against oatmeal to look at his mother with the expression of a person trying to understand complex information. Samuel, who was 10 now and had become remarkably thoughtful in the way that children sometimes do when they have been given both love and responsibility, looked at Quinlan and then looked at his mother and smiled slowly. "Another one," he said. "Another one," Genevieve confirmed. Clara, 12 years old and already showing the artistic discipline and independence of character that suggested her future would be her own, said, "I hope it is a girl this time. Thomas needs someone to teach him how to behave properly." Thomas indicated what he thought of this assessment. Quinlan looked across the table at Genevieve and felt the same thing he had felt the first time, that enormous wordless swell, and added to it now the second layer of knowing her better, knowing their children, knowing their life together in the accumulated and irreplaceable detail of daily years. She was looking at him with a small, private smile, the smile she kept for him, the one that had taken most of a year to arrive and which had been arriving reliably ever since. "Well," he said. "Well," she said, Clara turned out to be right. In November, a girl arrived. She was born on a cold, clear night, much calmer than the January blizzard of 3 years before. though Quinlan stood at the window during the long hours of waiting and looked at the clear sky and thought of that other night with the kind of fond vertigo that comes from understanding exactly how much has changed. They named her Analyze, which Quinlan had suggested quietly, and when Genevieve heard it, she looked at him with the particular expression she reserved for moments when he did something that confirmed what she had decided about him. "After Anne," she said. "If you do not mind," he said. "I do not mind," she said. I think she would have liked that. Analyze arrived in the world with a full complement of opinions and a volume that impressed everyone present. She had Quinlan's gray eyes and her mother's auburn hair, and an expression, in those first hours, of profound dissatisfaction with current arrangements that her whole family recognized immediately as entirely familiar. "She is exactly like you," Quinlan told Genevieve. "She is exactly like you," Genevieve said. Clara, holding her new sister for the first time, looked down at Analyze with an expression of such complete and unguarded love that Quinlan had to look away for a moment to compose himself. Thomas regarded the new arrival with the philosophical acceptance of a 3-year-old who had already learned that the household had a tendency to expand when you least expected it, and that this was generally not unwelcome. Samuel sat beside his mother and held her hand, and told her she had done well, with the solemn courtesy of a boy who was becoming a very fine person. The winter of 1881 was the warmest in several years, and Quinlan took note of this with a gratitude that was perhaps disproportionate but entirely genuine. He had not forgotten the cold. He carried the January blizzard of 1878 somewhere in the permanent record of himself, not as a scar but as a marker, the before and after of it. Before that night, a man with a life of motion and no fixed point. After it, this. He carried the badge for 3 more years, riding the county with the same thoroughness that had always characterized his work, but with the different quality of a man who has something definite to come home to. Then in 1884, when the county offered him a different position that would require relocation to Wichita, he declined it. He sat at the kitchen table and told Genevieve about the offer, laying it out honestly with the good and the bad of it. She listened to all of it and then said, "What do you want to do?" "Stay," he said immediately. She looked at him. "You do not have to give up your work for us." "I am not giving it up," he said. "I am staying because I want to stay, which is different." He held her gaze. "I have been looking for a place to be for most of my adult life. I found it. I am not leaving it for a promotion." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Clara is going to Wichita in September. The artist there, Mr. Denton, she has been corresponding with him and he has accepted her as a student." "I know," Quinlan said. "I am very proud of her." "She will be fine," Genevieve said, in the tone of a woman convincing herself of something she already knew. "She is ready." "She is," he agreed. "She has been ready for 2 years." He could see what was under the surface of Genevieve's composure, the mother's grief of a child leaving, the pride tangled up with the loss of it, and he reached across the table and she took his hand, and they sat with it together. Clara left in September, on a day that was warm and golden, with her drawing pads and her pencils and a set of oil paints that Quinlan had ordered from Wichita as a parting gift. She had held on to her mother for a long time at the wagon, and then she had held on to Quinlan, who had held her back with the full, uncomplicated feeling of a man who had watched a girl become herself and was proud beyond what he had words for. She turned back once as the wagon moved away down the road and waved, and Quinlan kept his arm around Genevieve's shoulders and waved back, and Samuel stood on Quinlan's other side with Analyze on his hip, and Thomas pressed against Genevieve's leg, and the wagon grew small on the road and then turned and was gone. Genevieve took a breath and stood straight. "She is going to be extraordinary," Quinlan said. "Yes," Genevieve said, and her voice was entirely steady. "She is." The years settled into a rhythm that was not static, but had the quality of something well made, varying with the seasons and the work and the daily demands of a life that was full in every sense, but returning always to the center of itself. The homestead grew and prospered in the way that things grow when they are tended by people who are paying attention. The children grew into themselves, each one distinct and irreplaceable, each one carrying something of both their parents and something that was purely and originally themselves. Samuel at 15 was the kind of young man who made adults trust him instinctively, steady and perceptive, already thinking about what he wanted to make of his life with the seriousness of someone who had learned early that life was not guaranteed. He was good with the farm and good with people, and good with horses, which Quinlan had always considered one of the more reliable indicators of character. Thomas was everything his name had not prepared anyone for, nothing quiet or contained, but brilliantly, exhaustingly alive, full of the kind of energy that either became something remarkable or burned itself up before it got there. And Quinlan spent a great deal of time in those years quietly channeling Thomas toward the former. Annalise was 3 years old and entirely herself, with her gray eyes and her auburn hair and her absolute conviction that the world should operate according to her understanding of it, which bore a striking resemblance to her mother's conviction about the same thing. Quinlan watched all of this and marveled at it in the private, inarticulate way that he had always marveled at things that mattered. On an evening in October of 1884, he and Genevieve sat on the porch in the last light, as they had made a habit of doing when the weather allowed. Annalise asleep inside, and Thomas allegedly also asleep but audibly not, and Samuel out at the barn with the horses. The prairie was going gold and amber with autumn, the sky enormous above it, the air carrying the first real edge of the coming winter but not yet unpleasant. A hawk moved in long, slow circles over the far field. "I want to tell you something," Genevieve said. He looked at her. "Then tell me." She turned toward him, and in the light of the falling afternoon she looked exactly herself, all the years of her and none of them diminishing what she had been that first September afternoon in his office. Direct and capable and fundamentally beyond any simple description. "When you rode through that blizzard," she said, "and you came to the door and told me you had dropped the medicine, I thought for one moment that you were going to tell me something was wrong with Samuel. I thought that was what you had come to say. And in that one moment before you spoke, I was more afraid than I had been in 2 years." He listened. "And then you told me what had actually happened, and I watched you think your way through it, right there in the doorway in the middle of the night," she continued. "And I thought, this is the person. This is the person who is going to be beside me." She paused. "I did not say it then. I was too frightened and too tired, and I needed it to work first, but it is what I thought." He looked at her for a long time. "Genevieve," he said. "Yes," she said, "I want to tell you something as well." "Then tell me," she said, returning his own words. "When I dropped the bottle," he said, "and I knew it was gone, I did not think about the ride back to Caldwell. I did not think about the cold or the hours it would take or whether anyone would think I had done enough." He paused. "I thought about a woman who was alone in that house with a sick child, who had been alone with it for 6 days, who was going to be alone with it through the night, and I thought that was not acceptable to me. That was the whole of it." She looked at him for a moment with that completely open expression that he had spent the better part of a year earning, and that had been his ever since. "You are a very stubborn man," she said. "Deeply," he agreed. She laughed, her full laugh, still his favorite sound in the world, and he put his arm around her and she leaned into his side. and they sat on the porch of their home in the October evening, together, on the prairie that had been the setting for all of it, the fear and the loss and the long work and the very great happiness. Inside, Thomas had apparently given up on the pretense of sleep and could be heard explaining something to Samuel at significant volume. Annalise, who could sleep through anything up to and including a thunderstorm, continued to sleep. The hawk above the field made one more long circle and then turned south and was gone. Quinlan Jericho sat with his wife on their porch and watched the last of the October light move over the Kansas prairie, and thought that if a man was going to be stubborn about one thing in his life, he could not do better than this, the particular and irreplaceable thing of being exactly where he was supposed to be, with exactly the person he was supposed to be with. The blizzard had been the worst night of January, 1878. The broken bottle in the snow. The cold so deep it was a physical presence. The hours of riding through a white darkness that gave nothing back. He would not trade a moment of it. He would ride through it again tomorrow, if that was what it took. He looked at Genevieve and she looked at him, and they both knew it, and they stayed on the porch until the stars came out, which took a while, and the warmth of the house behind them and the enormous dark sky above them were both exactly right. And Quinlan Jericho, who had once been a man with nowhere particular to go, was home.